Hello and welcome to Team Malawi's presentation on the science of brewing beer. This is our outreach project for Chemi 500 at the University of Pittsburgh. And we hope that if you don't know much about the science and engineering behind the brewing of one of America's favorite drinks, that you learn something today. So the things that we're going to be going over is just the overall process from grain to enjoying the beverage. The processes are the grain selection, malting of the grain, mashing, boil kettle, cooling, fermentation, storage, and then finally enjoying the beer. And if you don't know what any of that means, don't worry, we're about to get into it. So let's start with grain selection and malting. So beer is a beverage that is made from grains. It starts with the selection of the grain that you want the beer to be based off of. Grain selection can be done for different flavors, colors you want the beer to be, and sugar content of the grain. After you have the grain selected, the next step is malting, and malting is just a fancy word for roasting. So you can roast the grains for different periods of time. You can see in the picture there on the left that some of those grains have been roasted for a lot longer. Longer roast time has a couple different impacts. Clearly it impacts the color, it turns darker, and those colors can carry through to the final product. Another side effect of a longer roast is less sugar. So the longer you roast the grain for, the less sugar that it will be able to release in the process. And again, we'll get into why sugar is important later. Another thing malting does is it impacts the flavor. So as the grains roast longer, they can develop different kinds of flavors from coffee-like to bitter, smoky, things like that. So once we have our grain selected and we've malted it, the next thing that happens is mashing. Mashing is a more biological process than it is chemical. I mean, of course, it is chemical because it is biology. So what happens here is after it's malted, the grain is put in some sort of vessel. In this picture, you can see it's a pretty large vessel. And it is mixed with hot water. The water specifically has to be between 148 and 156 degrees Fahrenheit. That is because, again, we're working with biochemistry, which is very finicky about where certain parameters need to be. What it's doing by adding this hot water is tricking the grain into thinking that it's being ready to be grown. So the hot water germinates the grain, and this causes enzymes within the grain to release sugar from the grain. Normally the sugar would go towards growing the plant, but in this case the sugar is getting absorbed into the water, and that's exactly what we want. So sugar will ultimately end up as alcohol, and this is why sugar content of the grain is important. The more sugar you have, the more alcohol you will have in your final product. It can also lead to sweeter flavors in the final product if you have a lot of sugar. So once the mashing is complete, you have a liquid that is, there's tons of grain in it. So the very next thing is the grain gets filtered out, and what the liquid you have after that is called sweet wort. It's called sweet wort because it is basically sugar water. That sugar water is transferred to a boil kettle, where it is then, as you may have guessed, boiled. It is brought to a boiling temperature first and foremost for sanitation. At this point, there's no telling what sort of microorganisms could have been in the grains, could have gotten into the liquid. So it's boiled to kill off anything that might have gotten in. The other reason it's brought to a boil is because of what are called hops. Hops are a plant. You can see in the top picture there, they look kind of like pine cones. And these pine cone looking things have oils in them, and these oils give a very bitter flavor to the beer, but can also carry along subtler flavors like citrus, floral, can even kind of taste pine-like, which some people really enjoy. And commercially, they are made available in pellets, kind of like in that middle picture there. This is a more efficient use of the hops as you get a more concentrated pack of oil per square foot or square inch of the pellet. So the boiling temperatures help the oil seep out of the hops and go into the sugar water. So that's why it's brought to a boil again. And now that the oil is in there, again, like I said, it has flavor impacts, but it's also a type of preservative. These oils are very, very good at antimicrobial activity. So back in the day, before we had modern types of preservation, hops were used to keep beer fresh and from developing any sort of bad infections. And at this point, now that there's the bittering effect of the hops, the sweet wort is now known as bitter wort. So once you have your hop oils in there for preservation and flavor, the next step is cooling and fermentation. So the bitter wort needs to be cooled down. Remember, it's at boiling temperature right now. It's 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And the next step, fermentation, involves live organisms, which we brought to a boil to kill off live organisms. So we have to cool it down to about 68 to 72 Fahrenheit before we can introduce the yeast. So once it's cooled down, then you introduce your fermenting organisms. And this is, again, where some biochemistry happens. There's a few different organisms that you can use. The most common is S. cerevisiae, which is a yeast. You can also use a couple bacteria to produce what are called sour beers. For those of you who know your beers, you'll understand that. Sour beers, for those of you who don't know, are just beers that taste a little sour. The fermentation process is what changes sugar into alcohol. So again, this is where the sugar content is important. As the more sugar you have, the more availability for the fermenting organisms to turn it into alcohol. And in addition to alcohols, fermenting can change the sugar into a lot of other chemicals. I won't go into the specifics, but you can get different flavors like spiciness, you can get fruity flavors, you can even get some really subtle, like kind of like the hops, almost citrusy or floral flavors, just from the chemicals produced by fermentation from the yeast. Another thing that fermentation does is it releases carbon dioxide, and this has two effects. The first is the obvious carbonation. Beer is a carbonated beverage, and this is where most of the CO2 in beer comes from. The other thing is a key principle in chemical engineering. Carbon dioxide is used as a scrubbing agent because another side effect of fermentation is the release of hydrogen sulfide, which, if you don't know, is the stuff that smells like rotten eggs, and it's really gross. You do not want that to be in your final product. So the carbon dioxide, as it releases from the yeast cells and travels upward through the liquid, it absorbs this hydrogen sulfide out of the liquid and carries it with it to the top where it's released and is no longer part of the liquid. This is something that is commonly used in chemical processes outside of brewing for meeting environmental standards. Say you have a gas that has all sorts of nasty stuff in it, you use scrubbing tactics, kind of like this carbon dioxide scrubbing, to get the bad stuff out of the gas before you release it to the environment. So that's a bit of a connection there. The other connection in this slide, the cooling, is definitely right up a chemical engineer's alley. You want to take something hot and cool it down. That involves things like heat transport, which is something chemical engineers learn a lot about. So that's something that a chemical engineer could design to get that optimum temperature from boiling to room temperature. Now then, once all of this has taken place, it's usually about 2 weeks until the fermentation process is completely finished and you have the right content of alcohol and other flavorful chemicals that you want. So once everything is done fermenting, next you need to store your beer. Now, this is where it gets a little hairy. Different beers can be stored in different ways, but for the most part, you want to keep your storage temperature between 30 and 55 Fahrenheit. This is just to help keep it fresh. And you also want it to be in dark places to avoid what's known as skunking. Skunking is an effect caused by UV rays, ultraviolet rays from the sun, entering the beer and causing chemical reactions that produce a smell and a flavor that is reminiscent of, as you might have guessed, skunk spray. So for that reason, cans are usually the best way to store beer so that the light stays out. If it's a glass bottle, brown bottles are better than clear bottles, but clear bottles are still used because sometimes it's nice to be able to see the liquid you're drinking. For beers that have yeast still in them, some beers keep the yeast in at the end, some beers filter it out. For the beer that keeps yeast in, you want to store it upright so that the yeast stays in place. It stays kind of in a suspension almost. So once you have your storage process complete, the last thing to do is to crack open a can, pop off a bottle top, and enjoy your beer. Responsibly, of course, and only if you're 21 or older. So thank you very much for paying attention. If you have any questions about this, please email us at the email listed there. And don't forget to fill out the form to let us know how much you learned from this video. Thank you very much.